My name is Edward Vajda from Western Washington University. I'll be talking about the Yeniseian languages of Siberia and how elements of grammar came to be the shape that they are in those languages. I really appreciate being able to give this presentation on a video instead of in person. I couldn't come to Germany. I really feel that I'm missing a lot in this not being at the conference. Yeniseian languages are interesting to study from an areal perspective because all of the surrounding language families are completely unrelated to Yeniseian. And that means that any interaction between these families has to do with areal contact instead of genealogical relationship. The Kets today, speakers of Ket are probably only about 50, even though there are over 1,000 ethnic Ket people. You see the black circle on the map. That is where the villages where Ket people live are located. But the Yeniseian family was a lot more extensive in 1600 when the Russians came to Siberia. It's the yellow south of the black area that today is the Ket's homeland. And this means that we can look at the Yeniseian languages and understand something of their own inner history when we try to understand how the different languages around them that are unrelated affected their structure as time went on. There's something called the Inner Eurasian Linguistic Area. Maybe you could even call it the Uralic-Altaic, using an old term, area. Basically, it's a Ugric, Samoyedic, the Uralic language family to the east, Turkic, Tungusic, and Mongolic languages. They all have certain features in common. Suffixal agglutination of inflections, well-developed nominal case systems, strongly suffixing verb. They're toneless, but they have vowel harmony. That means that the vowel of the root of the word is projected, or certain features of it are projected onto the suffixes that are agglutinated onto it. And relatively simple phoneme systems when you compare it with Native America, with parts of Southern Asia and the Caucasus. So all of these features are the features surrounding Yeniseian. And the Yeniseian languages have gradually taken on some of these features. The Ket language has taken some features on that some of its southern extinct relatives did not take on. By comparing the known Yeniseian languages, we can see what the original typological profile of Yeniseian was. And we can use that as a baseline to understand what is the areal influence of the surrounding languages. And that's what I'm going to try to do in this lecture. The Yeniseian family, the known Yeniseian languages that were documented by some linguists and also adventurers in the 1700s and 1800s, can be divided into 4 primary branches, maybe 3. The Kot branch, very different than the Ket branch that is still alive. And there's also Pumpakol, which looks like a southern, different branch than the other 2. And Aren, which is also quite different, but probably if you look at the structure of the verb, there are features, shared innovations that mean that it might be early branch off of what had been Keto-Aren branch, although that's not really firmly established. What is established is that the internal structure of this family is deep enough, probably couple thousand years, if not longer, that you can see what the original structure of the grammar is, and you can trace instances of grammaticalization from influenced by the surrounding languages. So the innovations in Kot versus the innovations in Ket tell us what is the original structure of the Yeniseian verb. The original Yeniseian typological traits that can be determined by this family internal comparison are possessive prefixes on nouns, completely different than all the surrounding languages, postpositional constructions, and originally not a full case system, also a complex templatic prefixing verb, which is radically different than all of the other languages of Inner Eurasia. And if one wants to project even farther back into the past than can be looked at by the Yeniseian internal data to see, one can entertain the Dene-Yeniseian hypothesis. And in reality, we can't say this is proven, but it sometimes comes in as a useful external comparison to understand what some of the features of Proto-Yeniseian may have evolved from at an earlier date. There are shared Dene-Yeniseian structural traits, and these are provable within the Yeniseian family, but sometimes their structure and origin becomes clearer when you look at the possible cognate and homologous structures in the Na-Dene languages of North America. There's also a system of possessive prefixes. There's also postpositional constructions, directional words, and these constructions in both families, as I'll show you, are based on possessive morphology that has connected with the prefixes that are possessive prefixes. So there's also a shared action nominal system in these language families, and a lot of homologies in the complex prefixing verb. Now, towards the end of this lecture, when I already have finished talking about the different kinds of grammaticalizations, the different kinds of areal influence that makes Ket part of this inner Eurasian language area, even though it's not a Uralic language, it's not one of the so-called Altaic languages, I'm going to try to explain why I think that this kind of influence occurred over the history of the Ket people, the Yeniseian peoples. And I think it has to do with the exogamous, the outmarriage structure of Ket society. And that influenced what was and was not borrowed from the neighboring languages. That's what we'll return to towards the end of the lecture. The Yeniseian family that was documented by Russians and Europeans starting in the 1600s, you see in those colored areas on the map, in fact is only a small portion of the geography of the family, as you can plot it using substrate river names that obviously are derived from the ancient Yeniseian word for river, Ses, something like that. And so we have a very large area stretching from northern Mongolia and Lake Baikal all the way through western Siberia and all the way in central Siberia to the Arctic. This area shows what the prehistoric interaction between Yeniseian languages and surrounding languages, which includes Turkic, possibly even some dialects of Mongolic, and a number of Ugric and also Samoyedic dialects. So the language mixing and language influence, also I should say Tungusic, Evenki on the east, it was quite long-term and quite extensive over a large geographic area. And that you can't see from looking at where the Kets are located on the map today. This period of interaction between Yeniseian and the surrounding Inner-Asian language families has led to a structural convergence of Yeniseian with especially Uralic languages and Turkic languages. And I'll show three kinds of structural accommodation that Yeniseian, at least Ket, has undergone probably in the last couple of thousand years. One is that the possessive prefixes that were inherited from Proto-Yeniseian gradually become clitics, and they detach and incliticize to a preceding word so that they no longer look like prefixes, which are very alien to the linguistic area. Also, postpositions develop into an oblique case system that mimics the case systems found in most of the surrounding languages. There are also usages of the cases that are very, very similar to what we find in Uralic and Turkic languages. And finally, the prefixing verb, which can be shown to have been prefixing based on Yeniseian internal comparison, even if one doesn't look farther to the Na-Dene comparison, has restructured itself so that in modern Ket, all productive formulas for making verbs are really suffixing now, even though the template is not changed and the structure of the position classes has not changed from when it was prefixing. And that's a very unusual trait that we'll spend a little bit of time looking at. There's also phonological convergence, and that is that the syllabic tones that was inherited by Yeniseian really are only retained in the monosyllabic phonological words, the words that are under focus in speech. And they become almost like an accent, a word accent in the other longer polysyllabic words. And the consonant phoneme inventory in modern Ket is impoverished in comparison to what you find in the original Yeniseian language family when you compare, and I'll go into that. And that's probably a result of also the convergence with the surrounding languages. But Yeniseian never developed vowel harmony, and that does set it apart from all the other languages in this linguistic area. The Kets show evidence of having contact with early steppe pastoralists, possibly even people earlier than the Turks. There are some words borrowed from reindeer breeders, from possibly early forest steppe horse breeders. But borrowing is not very characteristic of Yeniseian. Yeniseian people even resist borrowing modern Russian words and invent their own coinages. So when we look at Ket shamanism, we see a lot of influence of the steppe cultures. We see the use of iron in the crown of the shaman. The native Ket word for shaman, senying, is cognate with Nadene words for shaman. The sen means to cure by singing. The ing is actually a gerundive suffix in both language families. But there's another root associated with shamanism that is also a part of complex words of the costume of the shaman, and the root is kut, and this seems to have parallel in South Siberian Turkic and possibly some earlier languages. So there are borrowings in Yeniseian, but the actual borrowings of morphemes with specific meanings or lexemes is not particularly characteristic of the language. The central thesis of this whole talk is that Ket borrowed very few morphemes and lexical items, or relatively few, but over very many centuries, as young wives from other language groups married into the Ket hunting bands, and as very young adults had to learn the Ket language over many, many centuries underwent a structural accommodation to the surrounding suffixal agglutinating languages that had to do with prefixes becoming pronounced like suffixes, and postpositions becoming used like case system, and also verb restructuring to becoming a suffixing verb. So the first instance of structural accommodation are the possessive prefixes. When we look at Ket and other Yeniseian languages, we have prefixes, his, her, their, my, that are preposed to the noun. And these are only prefixes if that is the beginning of the sentence or the beginning of the phonological phrase. Otherwise, they detach and become enclitics to a preceding word, and that is their favored way of pronouncing. So on the left here, you see the proclitic pronunciation, dakus, his tent. But if you pronounce this in the middle of a sentence, his tent is not at the river, it would sound like seskara gus bensang. So the word that means his is not a prefix or proclitic, it's an enclitic on the completely more syntactically unrelated adjunct seska, which means at the river. And this is a typical way that modern Ket is pronounced, and it makes it a lot less like a prefixing language and more like the suffixal agglutinating languages that are spoken by the neighboring peoples. At least superficially it makes it that way. If you look at Yeniseian possessive markers, the southern Ket markers on the left can be either prefixes or actually proclitics or enclitics. They prefer to be enclitics. The yuch possessive markers tend to stay prefixes, and that demonstrates that this is an innovation in the Ket. The Kot have cognate preposed elements, but we don't really know how Kot was pronounced in context. I can't really say that they weren't encliticized or proclitics in the Kot language, but they are preposed to their noun. So here is two ways of pronouncing the southern Ket. The clitic, and I say ditropic, that's a word that means the clitic can either be a proclitic or an enclitic depending on the phonological context. So the word for my tent, if I were just saying it alone or starting to pronounce it, would be pchus. But if I'm saying it in the middle of a sentence, formerly my tent stood there. So it would sound in Ket as if you're saying, formerly my tent stood there. And that sounds like a suffix on the preceding word. And that's the way all of the possessive markers work in modern Ket. It makes it very different than a typical prefixing language. This happens with all of the possessive markers. So if I want to say your son, kup, But if I say your son is at the river, once again I'd say seskar hip usang. And the possessive marker would be incliticized to the adjunct seska at the river. So to summarize the first accommodation, we have what are called ditropic clitics, which are really an unusual, typologically unusual feature. You usually have an enclitic or a proclitic, but not one that does both kinds of behaviors. And so the modern possessive pronominals have this alternation that makes them more like a suffixing language. The next accommodation is that the postpositional constructions in Ket have become, a subset of them have become very much like oblique case endings. But the case system of Ket isn't really a full-fledged case system because you don't have nominative case, accusative case, and I'll show you, you don't really even have a genitive case. You only have some oblique cases that are just like the Uralic and Turkic and Venki languages in many ways. So the modern Ket case system is pretty much of a Frankenstein. It's a homogeneous thing. The subject and object is just no marking. The genitive is really just that enclitic of the possessive pronominal marker that is not really a suffix. And then we have oblique cases that are sometimes including the genitive marker. That's the ones you see in the center with the red element. And then sometimes they're not. And so modern Ket doesn't have a full case system. It's a mixture of noun-like postpositions and grammatical markers that have become very generalized in their function and function like oblique case markers, like the ablative, the dative, and several others, about 6 of these. There's a basic case in Ket that's not a case at all because the subject and object relations are marked verb internally. They're not indexed on the pronominals or on the nouns that are the grammatical subjects and object. So bubu datong would be she sees him. Bubu ditong would be he sees her. Okay. Genitive case, once again, you never have the genitive marker as the final marker in the word. It has to be followed by a host. Even if it's an enclitic, it has to be followed by the possessum. You cannot have it at the end, so it's not really a suffix at all. It's those same possessive markers that have become enclitics. Okay. There's a generic possessive connector that was probably ngwa, because in Kot it has a behavior that's different than the cognate to the Ket nga in other instances. Some of the Ket markers for cases have these possessive elements, which is a pronominal, and then what I believe is the possessive connector, generic possessive connector ngwa. And in Kot, you see the same thing, but in Kot, the possessive marker only survives after another nasal. Otherwise, it has lost its nasal pronunciation, even though in the transcriptions on the right, you can see that there was some pronunciation that was left from it. So there's possessive augmented cases that hint at where these case systems came from, pronominal possessive postpositions. And then there are non-augmented case forms where the possessive marker was lost. And when one reconstructs Proto-Yeniseian, it looks like if the old postposition that became the case marker had a labial anlaut, for whatever reason, that caused the possessive element that preceded it to delete, to elide. I don't understand why that is the case. Maybe we'll understand better the origin of these possessive nasals when we look at the cognates in the Athabascan languages, in the Dene languages, because there is this nasal class prefixal N in many Athabascan languages. In Iyak, it's an L. That's a regular sound correspondence. And this appears to be cognate with the possessive nasal in Yeniseian. So perhaps studying Yeniseian development of case system, where the remained, where it was lost, and studying the Athabascan system of nasal class prefix possessives, inalienable class possessed nouns, we might be able to understand something about the development of these structures in both language families. There's a shared Dene-Yeniseian possessive construction that is used for postpositions, directionals. It's also used for gerundives or action nominals. And we have strings of what appear to be cognate morphemes here. But this helps get an idea of where the Ket case system came from. But why it developed is you have to look to the neighboring languages inside of Central Siberia. So we have a postpositional noun in Ket, it's un, in Kot, it's han. It's cognate with the Athabascan word for a belly, underside, and it has become the word under. And it's preceded, as you see here, with possessive morphology, and it's succeeded by possessive morphology and a case ending. And so all this concatenation of possessive morphology, postpositions, possessive morphology, case-like postposition makes the Ket nominal system look very, very much like the surrounding suffixal agglutinating nominal grammatical systems that you see in the other languages of Inner Asia. So here we have again, kustingha. It means it's located under the tent. And we can make long strings like that by connecting what used to be simple possessive prefixed elements. We can make strings that look very much like suffixal agglutinating languages. Here's another one, kustidingal, out from under the tent's belly. And you can make a very, very large number of these. Okay. And some of the postpositions do not have the ability to act like cases. They can't end a word. They always have to have a case-like postposition after them. So there are a large number of postpositions and about 5 or 6, actually 6 ones that are like cases that can end the word. But they're all oblique cases. You don't have any of the core cases, which makes the Ket case system very unusual. All right. Now we can, in my paper that I'm going to write for the aftermath of this conference, I'll also go into features of the use of cases and constructions with cases that are very much influenced by neighboring languages. And one thing that you find in the Yeniseian languages, but also in neighboring languages, is ablative case-based comparative constructions. So if you want to say a reindeer is smaller than an elk, basically you're saying reindeer, elk from, small is. And that's a typical way of making comparatives in this area of the world. I suspect the Yeniseian picked it up through areal contact. But they used their own internal morphological elements, native elements, not borrowing any of the elements from the surrounding languages. They only borrowed the formula for doing this. And in noun phrase construction also, in Uralic languages, some Uralic languages, in order to say one of a pair, like one of a pair of eyes, or one of a pair of ears, you say a half eye. And this is exactly the pattern that we have in Ket, but with native Ket morphemes. So des would be eye, or but we don't know what kind of eye. It's just generic eye. But if you want to say one of a pair of eyes, you'd say kolep des, half eye. So this is another feature that has grammaticalized in Yeniseian, and it seems to have been influenced by the surrounding languages. So to conclude this second structural accommodation of Ket to the surrounding languages, we can talk about the agglutination of multiple post-posed relational morphemes that had originally been possessive constructions with postpositions. Some of the postpositions are still like postpositions, others have become like oblique cases. And the Ket case system, if you want to call it that, the noun morphology, the grammatical noun morphology, is a hybrid system of oblique cases, postpositions, and no cases at all, where you'd expect a case system to have some kind of case. Finally, the third structural accommodation is the strongly prefixing finite verb. When you look at the Yeniseian verb, it looks like nothing else in Northern Asia. You have an interdigitation of lexical morphemes and grammatical morphemes, tense, mood morphemes, person, subject, object agreement morphemes, and the oldest verbs in the language. Also, you can have formulaic stems. In order to have a stem in a dictionary, you basically have to have a formula like you see at the bottom of the screen there. You can't have a pared down stem that looks like a word without an ending. So this is unique. It's very different from all the surrounding languages, completely unique. In the oldest layer, the core vocabulary of Yeniseian finite verbs, all of the verbs are prefixing. In other words, we have a semantic peak at the very end or near the end of the verb. That's at the top you see there. And all the other markers in the verb, the grammatical markers and some of the lexical derivational markers, they're all prefixes, obviously prefixes. But only 10% of the verbs of Yeniseian work like that, just like strong verbs in English. 90% or more of the verbs now have a very salient lexical element, a root, at the very opposite end of the verb, at the leftmost edge practically of the verb. An incorporated noun or adverbial, or sometimes an incorporated action nominal that has started to function like the root of the verb, so that everything after it is de facto the suffix. And this looks very much like the surrounding suffixal agglutinating languages, even though the template hasn't changed and there have been no new positions added to the template in a couple of thousand years at least. When we compare it to Kot, we know that that's the case. But the Areal influence has restructured the verb in this striking typological way. There are also the one prefix slot that's before the incorporated root. That couldn't be changed so easily. It's still a prefix. But what happened to that is the same thing that happened to possessive prefixes in the nominal morphology. What happened is that it became a ditropic clitic. It tries to encliticize to any available preceding word to get rid of it, so that we have a root, a lexical element at the beginning of all the productive types of Ket verbs, 90% of the Ket verbs. So this would be the internal structure of a verb that means they bring me here by sled. But that de, that is at the beginning of it, is separated by a special clitic boundary from the rest of the verb, from the lexical element that begins the rest of the verb. And it's either not pronounced or it's pronounced as an inclitic on the preceding word. And this happens with the majority of the verbs in the entire language. Only with ancient short verbs do you still have those pronounced as part of the morphological, or actually the phonological verb. So if I were saying they used to bring me here by sled, I'd say bung bar tang bokolben. And the de, the subject marker, is become an enclitic on the habitual marker ba, and it's pronounced separately. There's actually a phonological word boundary between it and the rest of the morphological verb. That happens with all the other verbs as well that are of this structure. So we would have an internal structure of da tetondak, she crossed the river by walking. But if I have a noun before it, we're going to have an encliticization of that last marker. And so we have kimar tetondak, kimara tetondak. And so once again, we got rid of that prefix that doesn't look like the rest of Inner Eurasia, and we start the verb with a lexical element. The functional dimension, we could get into details about that. All of these elements are in all of the verbs, both ancient and recent, but it's really the position 8, the position 7 incorporate that has become the main pivot semantically of the verbs. So I won't go into the details here. The ancient verbs was the position 0 base that are still the main lexical element in the verb. And these verbs don't lose their position 8 marker by encliticization. It's still a regular prefix on the verb. So I flew, dindok, he died, dongho. Those are still pronounced like prefixing verbs. And these are the verbs that have cognates in Athabascan languages, by the way. Many of them do. So this was the core verbs. These are the verbs that also have cognates in Kot, the same structure in Kot, so you can see that Yeniseian internally, this was a prefixing verb. But noun incorporation became a more widespread phenomenon with certain bases, and so that what we have is noun incorporated verbs where we have the nominal element at the very beginning of the phonological verb. And this is very much like surrounding languages. Even though these languages don't have incorporation, they have lexical elements at the beginning of all of their verbs. There are a lot of these patterns. I won't go into it. I'm going to send the PowerPoint. You look at it yourself at leisure. But there are about 32 patterns of productive verbs in Yeniseian, and they all have incorporated elements that are the main lexical part of the verb in this position 7, with the detached position 8, markers that have become enclitics on the preceding word. So this is a pattern that you can see is overwhelmingly predominant, just like regular verbs are predominant in English and strong verbs are in the core vocabulary. The strong verbs are equivalent in Ket are the prefixing verbs. So I have a lot of examples of that, of these formulas that illustrate this pattern that has become so prevalent in Yeniseian. We don't really need to go into them. So what I'm trying to show is that the Ket template was preserved, the morphology was preserved, but the technique of using it went from prefixing to suffixing semantically. And it makes the Ket verb, even though it's so radically different in its structure and origins, sound a lot more like the surrounding languages. That is the Areal influence. There's the pseudo-incorporation that happens. And so I have a lot of patterns of this in the PowerPoint also. You can see all of the different patterns for making these new type of essentially suffixing verbs. And these are highly productive in the language. The prefixing style is unproductive entirely. So I have all of these examples of these patterns. And the conclusion here is that we have the same 10-slot template. It's persisted through thousands of years. We can know that by comparing it with Kot. We can see that only one position class was added to Kot, only one to Ket within probably 2,000-3,000 years. Very conservative. But we have a radical typological semantic change from prefixing to suffixing. That must have been due to typological accommodation to the surrounding languages. And this was done with no borrowing of lexemes except for some foreign roots that are incorporated into the position 7. That's all. So the modern Ket verbal lexicon is also a kind of a Frankenstein. We have less than 10% of prefixing verbs. Then we have noun incorporating verbs that have more of the ancient semantic structure. And then we have the so-called pseudo-incorporation where we have action nominals incorporated, and the original root has become a marker of transitivity, a marker of repetition. It's very, very much not like a root anymore. So the Ket finite verb shows a very unusual, typologically unusual mixture of suffixing and prefixing, and this strange typology can also be laid at the feet of Areal influence. I mentioned a couple of things about the modern Yeniseian phoneme inventory. There are only 7 vowel phonemes. The one that is the barred I is really a high back unrounded vowel. It should be that symbol that looks like a rounded W, or in Turkic languages it's the I with the 2 little dots on top of it. The Ket vowel system is fairly simple. There is no vowel harmony. The suffixes have their own vowels. But what is unusual about Ket is that it has monosyllabic tones. Monosyllabic words have these tones. So we have minimal pairs like koi, that's a kinship term. Koi means a desire or a wish. Koi is neighboring or nearby. And koi is bare. And so by the laryngalization or the rising and falling of the tone, you have completely different lexical items. And when you want to understand where these tones come from, you compare them with the Dene languages, and it all has to do with whether there was a glottal pronunciation at the end of the syllable. If it was, you get the Ket high tone. If there was not, you get the Ket laryngalized or fading tone. And this works with many cognates in the 2 language families. And the glottalization is still present in Eyak and Tlingit, and in a few Alaskan Athabaskan languages, so we know exactly that it really was there. And so in Alaskan, in Dene languages, you have tones. High tone in some languages is related to high tone in Ket. In other languages, it's related to the fading tone. And in the languages that are in yellow, you don't have the tone develop at all. You still see what caused the tones, the glottalization. The modern Ket phoneme inventory of consonants is pretty simple, and it's not radically different than the other languages. But when we compare Ket and Yuk and Kot, we find that for every time we have a Ket t or a d or a k or some of the other sounds, we really have in Proto-Yeniseian 2, 3, sometimes 4 distinct different phonemes. So there has been a loss of phonemic richness as time went on, and I believe that's also an accommodation to the surrounding languages. And so now we get to some attempted explanations of why this accommodation took place. Why did Ket take on this Areal influence with very little borrowing and a lot of almost accidental structural accommodation? One thing is certain about the Kets: they're the last hunter-gatherers of Inner Asia. They're surrounded by pastoral peoples. There were hunter-gatherers on Pacific Rim, but those in Asia were completely unrelated to the Kets. The Kets were traditionally divided into two outmarriage groups, which they have various subdivisions, but they were a fire people and a water people. And I believe that they probably had two different origins in Inner Eurasian peoples in the past. The more male-dominated culture was the winter culture, was the hunting culture, where Kets went upland on small rivers, away from the larger rivers, and hunted elk and moose, and sometimes aroused bears out of their dens and hunted them. The Ket culture in the summer had female goddesses, was oriented towards the rivers. Duck hunting and also fishing occurred at this time. The Kets got into larger groups, exchanged marriage partners, and this all happened near the water's edge. Ket society was very strongly patriarchal, like many of the pastoral societies around the Kets. Women were often inducted from neighboring tribes as young brides into the Ket. And I believe this is the reason for the type of structural changes that happened in the language. Words weren't borrowed, that was disfavored, but the pronunciation of the mothers is going to naturally be affected by their own native languages, which were suffixal agglutinating languages. When we look at the DNA of the Kets, we find that the Y chromosome DNA, which shows male father to son ancestry, it's overwhelmingly similar to Native American DNA. And also the neighboring Selk'nam have some of the same, because these were people that used to speak Ket that became Uralicized. When we look at the map, it's striking how the Kets are the only ones that have this overwhelming ancestry shared with Native Americans. What this says to me that the Ket males, the Ket-dominated male society and the Ket language have an origin that is in one direction, backwards. When we look at the mitochondrial DNA, which is shared by the mother to both the daughters and the sons, but only the daughters pass it on, it shows you the ancestry on the female side. The Kets are very complicated. They have some Western DNA, U haplotype, H haplotype, and they have A haplotype shared with Native Americans, a C haplotype shared with the Eastern reindeer breeders, and an F haplotype that no one else has in Northern Asia anymore. So the H probably came in with intermarrying with peoples coming in from Western Eurasia, the C from Eastern Eurasia, and haplogroups A, U, and F, they're more ancient. There's a project, Baikal Archaeology Project, that has looked at 9,000-year-old burials near the tip of Lake Baikal, where probably the Yeniseian homeland was in this general area, according to place names. And it turns out that the mitochondrial DNA of these people was very much like the modern Kets. The haplotype F was very prevalent in this group. And that makes strong circumstantial evidence that at least the female ancestors of the Ket were in Siberia a very long time ago. And they were not really connected with Native American female DNA. They were from these other groups. And my hypothesis is that hunters carrying the Q haplotype shaded with Native Americans intermarried with the fisher folk along the water in early times, acquired the U and F haplotypes predominantly from them, and this gradual accommodation to the suffixing was probably going on even earlier than the last few thousand years. It's very difficult for us to know what peoples and what languages the Kets were actually interacting with at that time. And the original Ket DNA, if one wants to go back that far, was probably the A that's shared with the Na-Dene. Over the time, as I've been saying throughout this whole lecture, the Ket pronunciation, the morphological structure, accommodated almost by accident, almost by a substrate influence from these wives being brought into the societies to all of the languages surrounding it. In the last couple of thousand years, these languages are definitely all suffixing, agglutinating languages. And this occurred with very little lexical borrowing, at least in the last couple thousand years. It's relatively little with this strong change of how the verb works, how the noun grammatical case system works, and also how the prefixes on possessive nouns works. When we look at today, the Ket people, majority of native speakers left are in this little village with 340 some people. This is where I did a lot of my field work. The elderly people still speak this language that has all of this ancient history of ancient interaction with surrounding peoples, possibly ancient connection with Native America. And my conclusion is that the typologically unusual features of Ket, the ditropic clitics, the case system that's not really a case system, the prefixing verb that's no longer really a prefixing verb, but it is at the same time. All of these unusual features are due to language contact. And one starts to wonder whether very unusual features, typologically unusual features all over the world might in fact be to language contact usually, and that might be a general conclusion. So I want to thank Andrei Malchikov and Walter Bisang, the organizers of the conference, for allowing me to make this presentation. And if I speak Ket to you, I would say, you speedily went, which means good job, bravo, you did good. Thank you very much for your attention.